Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all to Bloomsbury House, the second London site of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My name is Adam Ward. I'm Director of Studies of the Institute, and it's my pleasure and privilege to chair this book launch. And I think you probably agree we couldn't have found a more literary setting in London than Bloomsbury for a book launch. The title of this book, Our Separate Ways, I think really captures the descriptive element of this volume. It audits a relationship that has historically had great cultural, political and strategic affinity invested in it and a degree of solidarity. It's never been a cloudless relationship, but it's certainly been one of significant mutual attraction on a number of different levels. But which is now being frayed, as the authors make clear, by a whole series of divisions. Divisions in the United States in respect to the value and the utility of the relationship. Divisions between the liberal and the conservative Jewish community. Divisions generated by demographic changes inside Israel itself. And perhaps also an overriding pervasive sense that each side has of the other, namely that they don't understand their self-interest or the interest of their counterpart. And all of this playing itself out in a Middle East that is fairly much in turmoil, as we know, and as I somewhat glibly earlier today said in a separate meeting, a region where the only bright spots on the horizons are actually provided by blazing infernos in the distance, given how many conflicts are actually underway. But the subtitle of the book, The Struggle for the Future of the US-Israel Alliance, captures its real purpose. This, I think, is a generally sympathetic approach to the alliance that thinks that the struggle is worth waging, as it were. But it does need to be informed by a strong realism, by a confrontation with the facts underpinning the elements of disagreement that there are, if the two sides are going to stand any prospect of arriving at a strategic concept for interaction, for a new modus vivendi that will be sustainable into the future. And I think that what Dana Allen and Steve Allen have produced here is a deeply serious, constructive, profound reflection which has been informed by their personal biographical connectivity with the subject, by their scholarly engagement of the debate surrounding it, and also, of course, particularly in Steve's case, which benefits from his insights in government and the US administration, where he's seen policy being made at real peak moments in the bilateral relationship and has played his part in that. So I'm going to turn things over to them, say nothing more except to congratulate them on their effort. Dana is going to start us off with 15 minutes of talks, followed by an equal 15 minutes from Steve, and we'll take it from there.
Adam, thank you very much. That was a summary that makes my job, I hope not superfluous, but thank you. I want to start also by thanking the Robert and Artist James Foundation, along with Mr. Rick Grove. Rick Grove and Bob James are two great friends of the IISS and Steve and me personally, and they helped make this book happen. Obviously, our editor, Clyde Priddle and his editorial team at Public Affairs, and many colleagues for both of us, and research assistants here at Dartmouth College for Steve, and colleagues including Adam, who's chairing this meeting, who helped make the book possible. And while I'm at it, my wife Elizabeth is sitting in the second row, and it's a cliche of authors that's absolutely no less true for being a cliche, that these things inject special domestic challenges, which I think I owe a lot to Elizabeth. Elizabeth was just saying this isn't the first time, but that's okay. This was, I think, a difficult subject, and because we took the difficulty seriously, I think we've written a very good book. I don't mean, or at least I don't only mean that the subject is controversial and acrimonious, though of course it is both. But it was difficult mainly because the topic, as I think Adam well summarized, required a truthful expression of how the two states and societies have mirrored one another across many dimensions: strategic, moral, political, cultural, and of course religious. And to capture as truthfully as possible all of these and other dimensions of mirror imaging, as we call it a few times in the book, I think it's necessary to explain why we believe and fear that the mirrors are cracking. Now, I want to emphasize the word fear. Steve and I believe that the rupture would be a great tragedy. We have been on a tour speaking to American audiences about this. But I do think it may require a slightly different level of explanation for a British or broader European audience. Just to dwell on this for a moment, I would guess that there are members of this audience who believe that the biggest problem, well, not the biggest problem, but at least a big problem, is that American support for Israel has enabled bad Israeli behavior, and that the best and maybe simplest solution would be for America to withhold that support. I think we disagree, and it may be our national perspectives. Speaking just for myself, I certainly wished at times that certain policies of the Israeli government were more effectively opposed by Washington. But a general and precipitous unraveling of the alliance would be a great tragedy. And I say this as a kind of American Zionist who has attached the relationship for historical, emotional, moral reasons. But I think it's fair to say, I also say it as a scholar of international affairs who knows that sudden ruptures of alliance systems can be very dangerous. So there are two substantial historical chapters making up almost a third of the book that give, I think, again, singing our own praises, a rich, nuanced, and honest historical account of the connections between the U.S. and Israel. That has been, of course, morally complicated and difficult, but also, in our view, profoundly necessary. I think it's also useful that this book was co-authored by an American Jew and an American Gentile, both, how shall I put it, of a certain age and a certain generation. Now, I'll return in a few moments to the significance of our generation and its foreseeable, if not imminent, exit from the stage. The Jewish-Gentile combination is important because the Jewish experience is obviously central to this story. But at the same time, America's long and visceral support for Israel can't be understood as Jewish support. It's broader and more deeply reflective of American traditions and purposes. It was also useful, I think, that one of us, as Adam has already stated, had a long career in government that brought into the frequent interactions and collaboration with Israel and Israelis. Steve's first posting was to the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, where he was there during the Lebanon War. Also during the Reagan administration, Steve staffed the joint political military group that gave operational substance to the strategic relationship. He worked closely with Israelis on counterterrorism during the Clinton administration, and of course his responsibilities on President Obama's national security staff included the Israeli relationship at a time when it came under significant strain. So Steve's experience imparts, I think, to the book valuable insider insight that's reflected in the historical chapters, as I said, because we are both old enough to have lived through much of that history, but also to the four chunky chapters in the middle that cover the crisis years of the Obama-Netanyahu governments, dealing in depth with disputes over Israeli settlements, the peace process, how to react to Arab convulsions that followed the Arab Spring, and whether to negotiate or bomb Iran because of its nuclear program. But let me make one thing clear. Although it's an insider account, this book does not belong to the genre of sort of insider TikTok or personality-focused psychodrama. Now, there obviously was a personality clash between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there have been some good efforts to examine the personalities involved for clues to the problem, including some particularly good reporting in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other publications. But what the personality-focused accounts tend to obscure is that there are significant substantive disputes between the United States and Israel. Let's start with the first one I mentioned, Israeli settlements. As a reminder, here's what the president said to Israel's prime minister. The United States government will not support the use of any additional land for the purpose of settlements. Indeed, the immediate adaptation of a settlement freeze by Israel, more than any other action, could create confidence needed for wider participation in these talks. Further settlement activity is in no way necessary for the security of Israel and only diminishes the confidence of Arabs that a final outcome can be freely and fairly negotiated. So those are familiar words. You're all familiar with the argument. Except it is worth noting that the president in this case was Ronald Reagan, and the prime minister was Menachem Begin, who said at the time that Reagan's words had occasioned the saddest day of my life. What does this continuity of American complaint tell us? I think we need to think carefully about this question. Some will say it proves that basically nothing changes, and if you're devoted to the alliance, there's nothing to worry about. Every president since Harry Truman has complained about aspects of Israel's behavior, but there is much more to keep the two countries together and the relationship endures. We think this reflects a dangerous complacency, and our warning about that is a central thesis of the book. First of all, the passage of time matters. Nixon administration economist Herb Stein once said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Reagan delivered that speech 15 years after the June 1967 war that started the present occupation. It has now been 50 years. After 50 years, the likelihood of a peace settlement ending the occupation regime over Palestinians looks vanishingly small. Now we can save for discussion the question of whether the U.S. can simply accept the demise of a two-state solution and accept that Palestinians would never have full democratic rights over the land that they inhabit. But I only observe that Hillary Clinton, who is really and undoubtedly fiercely pro-Israeli, published an article in the Forward last fall about her commitment to Israel. The title of it included the words unbreakable bond. Her first agenda item on that article was to restart the peace process and get to a two-state solution. It's not the agenda of someone who I think is going to acquiesce to a creeping annexation of the West Bank. I think the second point I'd make is that the tolerance of Reagan and subsequent administrations rested on a rounded, deep, and cross-dimensional relationship of values, culture, religion, strategic interests, all the things I noted earlier. We are about to run a very dangerous natural experiment to see what happens when some of these dimensions are removed. It's simply not Ronald Reagan's America anymore. The country is becoming more diverse and the country's youth is becoming less religious. Now, we can argue about whether the country is becoming more liberal. I think the evidence for this is strong, and we present that evidence in the book. In any event, it's nearly impossible to argue against the proposition that the Democratic Party is moving to the left. And we have already seen how Israel has become a partisan issue in America in a way that it really wasn't before. I think Steve may talk a bit more about the Israeli side of the equation. But if I were an Israeli, I would be very worried about tying the cords more exclusively to a Republican Party that is currently, by definition, the party of Trump. A kind of Islamophobic panic might be a certain kind of basis for a continued alliance, but it's not a very satisfying one, and it certainly doesn't reflect the best of American or Zionist values. The most fundamental problem is this. We, Steve and I, are of the post-war generation upon which World War II, the centrality of the Holocaust, the rightness of Israel's cause in the early wars, including the Six-Day War, are really imprinted. And we don't have that much time left. I mean, I may be overrating this, but a woman 11 years older than me will very likely become the next president, but you can pretty easily count the number of years that our generation will be running things. And in these terms, a political window is really closing. The new generation is the Sanders generation. Now, obviously not 74-year-old Bernie Sanders, but his followers. Polls show that they are less pro-Israeli and more concerned about the Palestinians than their parents. And this applies, of course, to his Jewish followers as well. What are the exact mechanisms by which this generational shift would change U.S. policy? I don't know. I don't pretend to know. You can always point to an asymmetry of interest. So, for example, the growing Hispanic population may not be as committed to Israel as former demographic structures, but they aren't going to vote on that anyway. That would be the argument. That would be the counter argument. But I'd say this. I would look at this year's Republican nominating process, culminating in Donald Trump, for evidence that change, when it comes very quickly and unexpectedly. And Trump, in fact, is a very good place for me to stop, because he also shows that change can be ugly. We would rather see a restoration of the alliance with Israel based on a restored vision of liberal Zionism rather than an unpredictable and very possibly dark future.
I'm going to rewind and go back to a more ironic time in American history. The Reagan administration, that's when I entered government. There was something then called the Cold War. And I know that some people in the audience will remember that. Not everyone, though. The senior citizens will remember it. It's difficult to convey at this remove how tense an historical moment that was. The U.S. was preparing to defend Western Europe against a massive Soviet-led Warsaw Pact armored assault. The U.S. had 250,000 soldiers in Germany alone, 250,000 soldiers in Germany alone, and we had massive air bases. NATO had massive air bases almost everywhere in Europe except for France, which actually participated in the military structure of NATO. Those were the days of the 600-ship Navy. Those of you who are Americans and participated in the defense debate at that time would remember that. And this was all due to the American threat perceptions and NATO threat perceptions regarding the Soviet Union. U.S. military planners believed, on the basis of intelligence information, that their Soviet counterparts had developed a multi-theater campaign plan. In that, with regard to the Middle East, it entailed seizing the oil fields of Khuzestan in Iran and positioning Soviet forces to cross the Shatt al-Arab, which is the narrow body of water that separates sort of Persia from the Arabian Peninsula, and cut off America's source of Middle Eastern oil. In retrospect, this seems like science fiction, with Soviet Special Operations Forces blowing the passes through the Zagros Mountains in northern Iran with atomic demolition mines. But it was a threat that had to be taken seriously. and indeed it was. Now, one of the concerns that the United States had at the time was that the Sixth Fleet, that is America's fleet in the Mediterranean Sea, would be vulnerable to Soviet air attacks when the war started, when the balloon went up. The Navy was therefore keenly interested in locations where its fleet assets could bunker and be repaired and so forth, and where carrier-based aircraft could land and take off if carrier decks were not available because the carriers were sunk by the Soviets. So naturally, the United States looked to Israel as one such bolt hole for the fleet. One naval officer, Commodore Jack Darby, foresaw a relationship with Israel at that time that would answer these needs. He was in the minority, actually, at least at the outset of his campaign, to reorient America's posture in the Mediterranean, its naval posture. But ultimately, he persevered and initiated what became a kind of strategic relationship between the U.S. and Israel, about which I'm going to say a couple of things. Because the U.S. request for assistance triggered a very interesting debate in Israel among those in the know. It was a very kind of quiet debate. Some of the Israelis participating in it asked whether it was really wise for Israel to involve itself willy-nilly in what might be a highly destructive war between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Might it be better, they asked, for Israel not to expose itself to those kinds of dangers, potentially catastrophic blowback? There was also another different source of skepticism. It was more probing, I would say. The question posed by that faction was whether predicating the U.S.-Israel relationship on strategic requirements was really the prudent course. After all, they said, strategic interests could change. I mean, they're bound to change. It's inevitable. What happens if Israel seeks to secure its relationship with the United States on the basis of shared strategic interests, but then one day wakes up to find that American strategic interests have changed? Wouldn't a safer course, they asked, be to continue to ground the U.S.-Israel relationship in shared values, cultural commonality, commitment to democracy, and so forth? They argued that this approach would work in Israel's favor, and had worked in Israel's favor, up to that point, and it had had the signal virtue of being immune to shifts in American strategic priorities. Now, the debate was resolved in favor of strategic cooperation, in part because the U.S. offered Israel military benefits that were hard to say no to, and in part because Israel's leadership was resistant to the view that the United States could be counted on to support Israel in a crisis just because of shared moral values. The Israelis were extremely suspicious of this, so they opted for the strategic basis, and they pursued it. Anyway, sure enough, the Cold War ended, and with it, the Soviet threat to the Sixth Fleet and to Saudi Arabia. Initially, the strategic vacuum in the U.S.-Israel relationship that resulted from this shift was filled by a shared concern about Islamic radicalism. Even though the U.S. and Israel didn't really see eye to eye on the threat, the U.S. was increasingly concerned about al-Qaeda, about which Israel could not have cared less. And Israel was concerned about Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, about which the United States could care less. Those groups weren't targeting the United States. But at least there was something to talk about. In addition, there was a dynamic peace process. And the peace process that was in play had both a strategic dimension and a moral component. It was a positive, multifaceted agenda. With the collapse of the peace process at the end of the Clinton administration, the outbreak of the second Palestinian uprising thereafter, and then the enormity of 9/11, the counterterrorism agenda got a new lease on life. So it stayed in play for a bit. But then things got complicated because Bush, that is George W. Bush, who made a lot of mistakes, he did have a sort of a serious visceral commitment to the democracy agenda and the freedom agenda. And the thing is, he applied that to the Palestinians as well as to others. He was, in that sense, a liberal interventionist. So when Arafat died in 2005, Bush leaned on the Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, famous hawk, to do more to foster the emergence of a Palestinian state. Now, we'll never know what would have happened, because Sharon subsequently became incapacitated. He had a stroke, and that was that. But it was pretty clear that for the Bush team, the peace process trumped counterterrorism as the pivot of the U.S.-Israel relationship. For them, for a Republican administration, it was values versus strategic cooperation, and values came out on top. I won't say anyway, values came out on top. So, okay, fast forward. Looking to the future after 8 years of, very tense dynamics that Dana described, we asked ourselves whether all that was just Bibi Obama psychodrama, or there was something deeper than a clash of personalities burdened by a couple of fleeting and ultimately self-correcting policy disputes. Now, we concluded on the basis of a pretty detailed look at demographic, social, and political trends in both the U.S. and Israel that the two countries were diverging and diverging more quickly than we had thought possible. Now, there was a wider regional dimension to this because we were watching this happen between the U.S. and Israel at the same time as U.S. alliance relationships with other countries in the region began to come under similar strains. So there was something going on that was even bigger than just the U.S.-Israel relationship. Anyway, Dana's talked a little bit about the U.S. side, so I'll just focus on the Israeli side briefly. The country, that is, Israel, is becoming more religious, less enamored of democracy, on the whole, less well-educated, and much less prosperous, more than likely, looking out 10 years, especially given problems in the education sector, ballooning ultra-Orthodox population numbers, shrinking productivity rates, and a serious brain drain. These are grave problems for Israel's political economy. The growing influence of religion in Israel is even true of the military. The Israel Defense Forces, where the ratio of religious graduates of its officer candidate school has rocketed in recent years. The days when the secular kibbutznik dominated the IDF officer corps are probably drawing to a close. Now, we can talk about whether these trends are good, bad, or indifferent from our perspective. I think I can speak for Dana on this point. Countries evolve over time in response to a lot of factors. Israel's evolution has no doubt been shaped by 100 years of of perpetual conflict, the role of the Holocaust in its creation, and the pull of religious identity in these very embattled circumstances. And in terms of the protracted nature of the conflict, it can hardly be argued that the perpetuation of it has somehow been all down to Israel. It's all been Israel's fault. In any case, as these trends consolidate, the goodwill that is tended to get the U.S. and Israel through strategic disagreements might well not be present in sufficient quantity to surmount such disagreements in the future. It certainly wasn't in the past 8 years. So, what does the United States do in this situation? Presumably, the U.S. has the option of just turning its back eventually. And it would be a slow turn. It wouldn't be a pivot along the lines that the Obama administration had talked about its Middle Eastern and European alliances early in Obama's first term. But the deterioration could simply be accepted. The relationship could become more transactional and disputatious, and the United States would handle it as it handles its relationship with Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, so forth. Dana and I tried to look at this from a somewhat, creative standpoint, and ask, well, what kind of bold action could be done that could arrest these untoward trends, or untoward from our perspective. So we offer one option, which is a treaty alliance that would formalize America's solemn commitment to come to Israel's defense and to help sustain Israel's own military capabilities, and a reciprocal Israeli commitment to withdraw from the West Bank and permit the international community to foster a Palestinian state. From our perspective, such an arrangement, a grand bargain, that's what the data referred to it as, could be successfully negotiated. If it could be successfully negotiated, it would keep the U.S. and Israel orientated toward one another, align the two countries on a fundamental issue that entailed both values and strategy, and restore Israel's traditional place in American politics as a truly bipartisan concern, a situation that no longer obtains. Anyway, our hope is that if we can be persuasive on this point, at least in the American context, the U.S.-Israel relationship could be renewed on a foundation, a more durable foundation. And we hope it would stir some debate, because if it doesn't, then the likelihood, from our perspective, is that the two countries will indeed go their separate ways.
Dana and Steve, thank you very much indeed. I think that gives an insight into what you can expect in this book. We'll now have some time for questions and comments from the floor. I'll try to get in as many as possible, and I have two people already. Just catch my eye and give your name, and if it's relevant, your affiliation for Dana and Steve's benefit. First of all, Nigel Inkster.
I'm Nigel Inkster, Director of Conflict and Cybersecurity at AWS. I'd like to ask both the speakers, and thank you for that very penetrating series of insights, into how they think Israeli strategists and policymakers are looking at this relationship. Do they actually start to think about a relationship that goes beyond that which they currently have with America, and if so, with whom?
Why do you address that? Now, who wants to go first? Steve?
Sure. Well, there's a kind of an inflection point now in Israel where views of the relationship are changing. We write in the book about a meeting that I had in Israel after arriving at the White House. It was my first trip there, and the then foreign minister, who is now the defense minister, Avigdor Lieberman, had his staff provide us with a briefing, essentially about Israel's alternative alliance possibilities, both within the region and in Asia, South Asia and East Asia. They were obviously in signal-sending mode. And to be sure, like most allies or client states, whatever you want to call them, they prefer their security commitments to come without intrusive obligation. So, and the United States is nothing if not about intrusive obligation. And Dana described, the constant pressure on the peace process as one example of that. So, I think as the Israelis have become more accustomed to their military superiority, their regional military superiority, I think they're tempted to look at ways in which they can secure their strategic needs without having to deal with issues like the peace process. So other sources of security or diplomatic support, so forth, begin to look pretty good. And when you add to that the Israeli sense of disappointment, profound sense of disappointment in the conclusion by the U.S. and Iran of a nuclear deal over against serious Israeli objections, they do think that, well, if the United States is supposed to be an ally, well, the U.S. has just done something that fundamentally compromises Israel's security, and so what significance does this alliance really have? So I think, they're at a sort of at a crossroads in the way they look at the U.S. relationship.
I don't really. I think Steve has covered it. I mean, you will hear this debate and then the realization that there aren't really any sound alternatives. But as Steve says, there are at least some Israelis looking for them.
Minister Ida from the Japanese Embassy. Just wait for the microphone to reach you.
My name is Shinichi Ida, Minister of the Japanese Embassy. Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation, and I learned a lot from both of you. Dr. Simon, you mentioned the George W. Bush and also the death of Arafat. Back then I was posted to the Japanese Embassy to the United Nations. I was in the Security Council. And back then there was some kind of euphoria, and we worked very hard to pass the Security Council resolution to endorse the Quartet roadmap. Back then there was everybody was talking about the two-state resolution, which Professor Allen basically said, I'm paraphrasing, it's dead. That is a shocking statement for UN diplomats like me, because it's still a dogma, even a dogma for the UN diplomats to working for. I'd say it's still our ultimate goals, which if both of you can elaborate on the statement that the two-state solution is dead, I would be certainly appreciative. The second is that since as a person working on the Security Council very hard, do you consider the Council just a talk shop, or do you see any limited role, however limited it might be, for the Security Council to work, to play in the role for the peace process? Thank you. 2 questions. Thank you very much.
Look, we recoil from the suggestion that the two-state solution is dying, if not dead, because we honestly don't see any solution. Any alternative. I mean, the alternatives are shocking and seemingly unacceptable, but just because they're unacceptable doesn't mean that they're not real alternatives. I think our idea of a grand bargain from the United States and between the United States and Israel is predicated on the belief that the window is now very, very narrow, let's say the Clinton administration, the Hillary Clinton administration, would be something like a last chance saloon. It would, and although in other aspects, in Washington they challenged us on the realism of our proposal, but basically it is realistic only in the context of these witheringly bleak alternatives. But just because something is unpalatable doesn't mean that we can't face the facts. And I mean, Steve has spent a lot of time on the West Bank looking at the actual requirements in terms of political and infrastructure sinew for a two-state, for a Palestinian state. One can certainly imagine how it would come into being, but I was talking to a senior member of the Clinton campaign staff who was also in the Obama administration, who said this is going to be the big thing the Clinton administration faces, is what happens, what's the moment when you really have to say there are not going to be side-by-side Israeli and Palestinian states. I don't think I've answered your question or your shock really, but the evidence does not point to an easy way that it can be resuscitated. Nonetheless, we think it's crucially important, and that's why we're proposing a somewhat idealistic grand bargain.
Steve. Yes, please. Jonathan Marcus in the second row. Sorry, did you have a supplementary?
No. I asked two questions. One is about the two-state solution, but the other is the Security Council.
Oh, quite right. Security Council, do you want to take that on? The role and utility?
I don't see the U.S. tabling a Security Council resolution on this matter. I mean, it's been talked about quite a lot, as you know, and it was a spur for this conversation back in 2014 in the January-February timeframe when the French had threatened to do that. But I rather think that Clinton won't. But I don't know. But I think there's more to lose than to gain by doing so.
Thanks, Jonathan Marcus.
Jonathan Marcus, BBC World Service. Fascinating talk. Two questions. I mean, one, do you think that the recent conclusion of the new nuclear aid agreement was a wasted opportunity? That this perhaps should be delayed, or there should be some greater quid pro quo demanded by the Americans for what was, in most senses, a very generous deal? Secondly, you set out the direction of travel, and it's very gloomy and it's very bleak. What sorts of things could happen to change that or to delay that rather bleak outcome? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, does the return of Russia as a major actor in the region delay some of the things you're talking about? Might there, in the wake of the Netanyahu era passing, be some possibility of a more significant restructuring of the Israeli political system? I mean, after all, still significant numbers of people in opinion polls, say that they are in favour in general terms of a two-state solution, giving up land increase. So there's some kind of Israeli recomposition politically necessary. But what are the kind of things that need to happen to get to a different destination point?
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Jonathan. On the aid package, a strong signal was sent by the United States to Israel because the fine print in the aid package derogates greatly from the sort of superficial image of the deal as being unprecedentedly and sort of magnificently generous, because it folds in a lot of the money that had been given to Israel over the previous 10 years in supplemental appropriations. It eliminates offshore procurement, which means that the Israelis can no longer spend 25% of U.S. foreign military funding within Israel. It all needs to be spent in the United States. And the banking arrangements are also altered in ways that remove Israel's use of interest on the money over the course of the year in which it's obligated. When you add all that up, this very large number isn't all that much larger than that of the previous 10-year MOU. So, perhaps that's not earth-shattering, but the thing is, it's significant. I would have thought. But as Dana will probably explain if he wants to, comment on this, making dramatic use of aid, abrogating aid agreements or holding certain actions on Israel's part hostage to aid agreements is not a very productive way forward from our perspective. But he can talk more about that. On your second question, it's sort of the black swan question, and if only I could see that, I'd play the market. But I can't, so I don't. I will say that looking at structural factors in Israeli society and politics, we don't see as likely political realignments that create governments interested in pursuing a two-state solution along the lines that Clinton and Obama, for example, have put forward.
I would just add just a couple of things. One is that, the assumption of the idea of a bold move in terms of a treaty alliance with really mutual obligations, which of course is why this idea has come up before. It came up, I think, in the early 60s, probably I think Ben-Gurion might have raised it. It certainly came up from the American side after the 67 war. And the Israelis were very diffident about it because they smelled a rat. I mean, they realized that they had just occupied new territory, and the United States would expect it to be returned. So there's no illusion on our part that this diffidence or reluctance to accept such constraints has disappeared in Israel. But we do think, and we sort of parse some evidence, that there is an older generation of conservative Israelis, and people like Benny Begin, who are not indifferent to the possible abyss of the end of, or the deterioration of the American connection, and could be made to think if such an offer was put on the table. And the Russian thing you mentioned was interesting. I mean, I assume you meant that a new Cold War dynamic would arise where I think that is overstating it a bit, particularly if you consider, just as one piece of an anecdotal data point, the fact that the Israeli ambassador to the UN was notably absent when the American ambassador was trying to round up votes to condemn the Russian annexation of Crimea.
So you've stated, what the basis of the grand bargain would be, the essential quid pro quo. If the two of you were sort of writing the treaty, what are the clauses and the sub-clauses in terms of these reciprocal mutual obligations, in terms of safeguards and other kinds of mechanisms that you would want to have written into that?
Well, I mean, the answer is that I'm not going to answer that, and it's impossible. But it would be
not going to give it away.
No, it would be a detailed and lengthy negotiation process. And actually, when we were sort of throwing this idea back and forth, one of the concerns I had was that Israel might be able to pocket the offer without really being encumbered by this mutual obligation. I mean, this is particularly possible because it isn't a two-sided issue. I mean, there is a third party, the Palestinians, and they have in the past, and they could in the future act as spoilers. You can imagine situations where Israel can't really be blamed for the inability to reach an agreement. But I think that there are two things I would say about that. First of all, it entails a real Israeli commitment, an unambiguous commitment to what we might call the Clinton parameters or even the Obama parameters. In my view, it involves, finally grappling with the settlements issue, which is, I think at the heart of irritation, if not the whole dispute between, I'm talking about U.S.-Israeli irritation. So I think, the serious mutual obligations could be worked out and stuck to. There's another point that others have raised with this: is why should the Israelis pay for something that they already get for free? Which is a fair question. But if you look at the last 8 years, and particularly in regard to Iran, the President of the United States has committed the United States publicly to using military action to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And the Israelis have very loudly and very publicly derided the credibility of that commitment. So it's not clear that they think they're getting it for free. And I would just, as to the credibility, as to what a piece of paper adds to this dynamic, I would just use a kind of thought experiment. If the United States and other NATO allies were today considering extending an Article 5 security guarantee to the Baltic states, I think the proposition would be preposterous. We wouldn't do it under current circumstances. But we have that commitment, and we would keep it. We would and possibly will honor it up to the point of military conflict with Russia. So treaties matter.
Thanks. Numiba Yaakov, please.
To pick up on Dana's, thank you, on Dana's last point, are you suggesting that Article 5 guarantee for Israel?
Yes.
Yeah, is that part of what you're saying? Well, I have the microphone.
I mean, it's not Article 5 because it's not NATO.
No,
but yes, the
type.
type.
What I was asking
Yes.
In case I didn't rephrase it, whether you think about an Article 5 type of guarantee.
Yes.
Because that comes up very often in Israeli Palestinian interactions. That comes up very often, the Article 5 type of guarantee, in more often than not recently, in terms of what Israel feels it needs because of the deterioration of the relationship between Israel and the US. And another factor that you've touched upon, but I think Jonathan asked, and I just want to say, the relationship between Israel and Russia is strengthening on all fronts. I mean, Steve was mentioning that he met Victor Lieberman and they gave this, and he and his staff just gave a speech saying, well, we've got, all these other alternatives. That penetrates beyond Lieberman into sort of deep into society. That you very eloquently mentioned the brain drain and the fact that the society is now less educated. The issue really is that the young generation believes that Russia is a more ally than the US. So I'm just strengthening from a local perspective the arguments that you had very eloquently outlined earlier. It's if I ask my nephew, completely secular age 17, age 19, he will definitely be, and he's got no Russian origin, will definitely be Lieberman or anyone of that sort of ilk. And in terms of where the society is going to, Jonathan, yes, of course, you've got polls. The polls are very complicated, as you know, in all countries. But the alternatives are dire, and the alternatives are not, they're not looking patterns. I didn't want to repeat what Steve said, but he touched upon it. I felt it was like the tip of the iceberg, and being very diplomatic, but all the points Steve mentioned are 100% clear, and it's the anti-democratic issue is terrifying, and there's no one looks up to the US anymore. I was a child, the US was a role model of democracy that Israel wanted to be like. I don't think Israel is a democracy, is terribly democratic. Thank you both very much.
Thank you. A gentleman here in the second row.
So hi, my name is Dan Hewitt, and I'm an economist. I've covered Israel for over 40 years. I'm actually ahead of your generation a little bit. I want to first of all say I like your quid pro quo proposal. I want to support it. I've always felt that the Israel-U.S. alliance is one-sided, frankly. I don't think the U.S. got very much for it. I go to Israel a lot. I have a political consultant there who tells me the U.S. is screwing up completely. They're just ineffective. They're terrible. They're screwing up. They're losing their influence. I read an interesting article yesterday in the Times. I was actually in the U.S. yesterday. And an analysis of Syria, which explained that the U.S., for which I support, is becoming less activist. We're becoming the group of people that said Iraq was a big mistake. We shouldn't have gone in there. And we've done this in Syria. We've been backward, sort of holding back. I guess I'm worried about unintended consequences of this. Even though I think we haven't gotten a quid pro from Israel, I do wonder if we leave that alliance behind, what losses we're going to have. I think in Syria, the losses have been an increased influence of Russia and, frankly, things going against what we would have liked to see. We've given up a lot. We're giving up a lot maybe in Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Israel, too. I don't know. I'd like to hear comments.
Yeah, I guess I see things a little bit differently. There's a reciprocal dynamic at work where traditional allies, including some that you mentioned, have embraced concerns and priorities that don't really align very well with U.S. strategic interests and objectives. So the divergence is not solely owing to the United States deciding that, I don't know, it was bored with the Middle East or something. That its interests were diverging from the interests of its traditional allies. And you see this at work in Syria, you see it at work in Yemen, and you see it at work vis-a-vis the nuclear deal with the United States. And
with Iran.
Pardon?
With Iran.
The nuclear deal, with Iran. So, I don't see a kind of unilateral dynamic at work. I think it is reciprocal, and in the region there's a great demand for what they call U.S. leadership, and in fact I heard it at the FCO on Friday. But it's kind of interesting because leadership is defined as the United States doing what its allies wish for their own purposes. And that's a sort of perverse definition of leadership. I guess my perspective is just a little bit different. Now, it may be that, at least for the time being, the U.S. and its allies have reached a kind of impasse, perhaps even an end of the road situation. I mean, we'll see. But to be sure, the bigger context, and I think you're correctly pointing to it, of the situation with Israel, the strains with Israel, the bigger context are strains with other traditional allies in the region. Now, one of the virtues, I'll just conclude on this. I mean, one of the virtues of the grand bargain we propose is precisely to keep at least one of those traditional allies orientated toward the West and toward the United States, because the lure of alternative azimuths for that ally's affections, as it were, is quite strong, as Nomi Bar Yaakov was saying, I think.
Thanks. Let's take a group of questions all at once, and then it'll be the cocktail hour, when you can have the chance of engaging the speakers directly without intermediation by me. So, yes, you, sir, in the jump for that. Just keep your hand up so the microphone knows where to go.
Thank you very much. I'm Ron from City University. I'm just curious to know what you think about the rapprochement between Turkey and Israel. Who needs to?
Thank you. There was somebody right at the very back, on my right. Yes, that's right.
My name is Ruben. I'm a master's student in international relations at LSE. So my question was regarding, do you think, given both the changing demographics in Israel and the fact that their links with places like India and China are becoming stronger, that such a deal could actually be sold to the Israeli public?
Yes, you in the Polonek.
Yeah, exactly. I am Baron, student of development economics at SOAS. I was actually wondering, you've spoken that it's not unlikely that, say, this relationship would end with the United States. In your opinion, how should Israel in that case proceed with regards to, say, integration in the area or maybe different alliances?
Then right behind you. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Randolph Ponsari. I'm a member of the Institute. My question is a follow-up on the role of Russia. Do you think that the outcome of Russian intervention on behalf of Assad is something that favors Israeli thinking? And if so, with the retention of Assad seems to be more favorable to Israel, would you consider that to be a further strain in terms of the kind of strain that you were talking about between Israeli-U.S. relations?
Last takers? No? Okay, 4 questions. Who wants to kick off on the first one, which was about Turkey and Israel?
Steve, that's yours.
I don't think that the rapprochement between Turkey and Israel is all that deep. I think that there are powerful limits to it in terms of Turkish public opinion, in terms of Erdogan's own orientation. Really, I think recovering anything even remotely like the closer ties between Israel and Turkey, that prevailed when the Turkish General Staff was the power to be reckoned with in Turkey, I just think it's quite unlikely.
Thanks. On the question of how, if at all, the deal should be sold to Israel.
Well, I think let me back up for a moment to state that I'm an editor of a journal, so of the Institute's journal, and I often, when I get articles, I often try to get rid of the policy recommendations in them, because I generally find the policy recommendation to be the least interesting part of it. In other words, an article or a book should, lay out the dimensions of the problem. Some problems don't have solutions. We think this problem is so dire that it should be possible to convince both American politicians and Israeli politicians and the publics on both sides, that something bold and somewhat radical needs to be done. But that's really as far as I'd be willing to go, because the likelihood of it is not something I'm willing to make great claims for, except compared to other benign solutions. What's that in that movie Argo? Is this the worst bad idea? The best bad idea you have, or something like that. Yeah, this is the best bad idea we could come up with. I think the question about how Israel should proceed if I understood correctly, in the event of very radical deterioration in the relationship with the United States, is not one I can really answer, because I just don't think it would be a good idea. I think they should stick with the United States, and I don't really see promising alternatives. But it's Israel. I'm American. They're Israelis, so it's up to them at the end. You want to say something about Russia? Does Israel like what Russia's doing in Syria?
Well, Israel hasn't really come forth. The Israeli government hasn't come forth with a sort of a consistent, I'd say, position, declaratory or otherwise, on Syrian policy and all that. There was some tears and flapdoodle in Israel about the American decision not to bomb Syria in August of 2013. I think the Israelis have a preference for, laying down the law, and the United States didn't, even though that whole episode resulted in the removal from Syria of a massive amount of very poisonous chemicals in the in consequence of which Israel quietly stopped its gas mask distribution program to the population. So, internally, they thought it was actually really great and a perfect outcome, but, they're in the mode of, beating up the United States a bit, so this was a convenient occasion to do so, I think. But as far as, the Russians are concerned, the Israeli government and the Russian government have very close communications. The Israeli Prime Minister has been in Moscow a couple of times, not very recently, but in the recent past. The current defense minister is Russian, as many of you know, and maintains very close ties to Russia. So, there's what social scientists call an affinity group in both countries, and that tends to reinforce the basis for alliance kind of behavior, alliance-like behavior. My own view is that the Russians are they're not a decisive influence in the region, although they are a decisive influence in Syria. But Syria was a Russian client for nearly a half a century, and that for the most part was I would say fine with the United States. I mean, I don't think that Washington was overjoyed by this, but it was a dispensation that the U.S. found it could live with at a time when the geostrategic stakes were much higher than they are now.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to encourage everybody to stay for a glass of wine. I'm sure there are still what's that?
And buy the book.
And buy the book. I was just going to say, I can do the promo for you, don't worry. There are copies still at the back for sale, and I'm sure that if you present a receipt or something like that, or your credit card, that these guys will be happy to inscribe the book for you in a very pleasant way as well.
I don't care whether they buy it or steal it or anything.
Yeah. Okay, and then I think there are quite a few people here from the Johns Hopkins Alumni Association, and we are kind of doing this event somewhat in partnership with them. So this is just to remind you that actually Dana Allen is speaking at one of their events later this week at 6:30 p.m. at the Hellenic Center up on Paddington Street, where he'll be among a panelist of people who are tackling the very narrow subject of the global impact of the US 2016 election. Dana published a blog on the presidential debate last night, and if you read it, I think it'll give you a flavor of what Dana can be like when he unmasks his batteries on some of these issues. So, Dana, Steve, thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and as I say, glass of wine.